Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Wednesday, May 20th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, getting the rules right early can shape both the safety and the growth of emerging technologies. Plus, one place those challenges are showing up is in energy and infrastructure. The administration is leaning on the Defense Production Act to shape supply chains through federal support, not mandates. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. Some adjustments to financial security, retirement payments, and insurance options for feds are in the beginning stages of consideration in Congress. 4 recent bills that House and Senate lawmakers have introduced over the last few weeks aim to tackle a range of benefit issues across government. Here with more details is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Nice to be with you today, Terry.
Let's talk about these bills as they go through. One of them looks at new insurance options for federal employees. Tell us more about that effort.
Well, this has really been a long time effort from Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton of D.C. She's been introducing this same legislation for, I think, about 8 years in a row now. And what this would do is create a short-term disability insurance program for federal employees, provide that optional insurance to them if, for example, they have a short-term injury or if they have to, for a short period of time, take care of a family member, or it can also be applied in the case of the birth, adoption, or if you're fostering a child. So essentially what this bill would do, and it's simply called the Federal Employee Short-Term Disability Insurance Act, is allow federal employees to opt into this program that would be run by the Office of Personnel Management. Employees would pay 100% of the premiums for their short-term disability insurance here and can receive those benefits for up to 1 year. This is something, again, as I mentioned, that Congresswoman Norton has introduced several times in a row. It hasn't gotten a lot of traction, but this being her last term in Congress, I think she's trying to make one final push here. She says that a lot of private sector companies offer this type of insurance to their employees and that she believes federal employees should have the same access there. There hasn't been a lot of movement yet because it was just introduced about 2 weeks ago. But this is one that's been referred to the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee for further consideration. So we'll see if this seems to move more maybe than it has in the past.
So that's at least taken one step forward. There's another recent bill that seeks to protect feds' credit scores during shutdown. Tell us about how this came about.
Well, the inspiration here, if you want to call it that, was the DHS shutdown earlier this year, where you had a lot of federal employees who had to go without paychecks for multiple pay periods in a row. This is what senators who introduced the bill said, was that in speaking specifically with TSA workers, that many of them were facing really significant financial difficulties, and that was not only affecting just their current situation during the shutdown, but that because they had to miss credit payments and other bills payments, it was having much more downstream and long-term effects for these employees as well. So the idea here is, even though pay is restored, there's still some impacts later down the road. The senators, and this is a Democrat-led bill in the Senate, they said that the idea here behind their new bill would be to protect federal employees' credit histories from any potential negative impacts during a government shutdown. So federal employees who aren't receiving pay and have to miss out on a credit card payment, that would not affect their credit score or credit history. And then that would continue for the entirety of the government shutdown and then an additional 30 days after the shutdown ends. So just giving a little bit of cushion there for employees to try to make up some missed payments that they might incur. So this bill was introduced in early May, so after the end of the DHS shutdown, but assuming that there will almost certainly be a shutdown at some point in the future again. This is the goal here, is to try to help employees a little bit through that process.
Some lawmakers are also looking to correct recent pension errors for certain federal retirees. What's the situation there?
This one is also related to the shutdown, this time from the shutdown last fall. And what happened then was, just for some context, is uniformed service retirees, the vast majority of them can continue getting their pension payments throughout a shutdown uninterrupted from the Defense Department's Military Retirement Fund. But lawmakers, this is a bipartisan bill, and these lawmakers found in speaking with some retirees that there was a loophole of sorts where, from two specific agency components, these retirees in the uniformed services were not getting their pensions throughout the shutdown last fall. This applies to the Commissioned Officer Corps at NOAA, as well as the U.S. Public Health Service Commissioned Corps. And that impacted about 8,000 of these retired service members who, unlike many of their other retired colleagues, were not able to continue getting their pension payments during the shutdown. So essentially what this bill would do is correct that error and make those employees whole for any payments they might have missed out on, so that in future government shutdowns, they'd be able to get their payments from that retirement fund, just as their other colleagues would.
And one other bill that would expand the 2022 PACT Act. What are lawmakers looking into there?
Well, just for a quick refresher on the PACT Act itself from 2022, the idea was with that, which did become law, was to create a presumption of exposure to certain illnesses, like certain types of cancer, for veterans who were exposed while serving overseas to toxic burn pits, which have been shown to be linked to a lot of illnesses. So with the passage of that, veterans do have the presumption of exposure for those illnesses if they were serving overseas at the time. This new bill finds that civilian employees like law enforcement officers, national security personnel, and some others who were also serving overseas alongside these veterans also faced, of course, the same exposure. So the idea here is to give them that same presumption of exposure and link, their service overseas to having, the potential to contract those illnesses. The lawmakers who introduced this bill, again called the Renewing Our PACT Act, they say that once those workers end up getting cancer or some other type of illness, it's difficult to prove the link between that and then the previous exposure, which could have been many years earlier. So the idea here is to simply expand the PACT Act to cover them as well.
And so, Drew, with these four bills that at least have been introduced, what's the prospect? Where do they go from here?
Some of them, I believe, obviously the bipartisan ones are probably going to have a little bit more likelihood of advancing further. But it seems like, it could be a range. I think the ones that are shutdown related might get a little bit more support or more pressure to be able to pass those, just because we know those have been really impacting federal employees and retirees recently. So, we'll see where it goes from here if committees start marking these up. But certainly it seems that there's a range of benefits-related issues that lawmakers are trying to tackle here.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for sharing these with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Terry.
You can find her full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, getting the rules right early can shape both safety and growth of emerging technologies. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize secure operations and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. A new GAO assessment looks ahead at emerging technologies where early decisions could shape how they're used and how they're governed across government. We talk through what those trends are and what Congress and agencies need to be thinking about now with GAO's chief scientist, Dr. Sterling Thomas. Dr. Thomas, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
This is not a topic we often cover when we talk to GAO. We're talking policies and processes. And with you, we're going to talk about science. When you think about the science issues that Congress asks you to cover, they're typically not very far over the horizon. What were you trying to understand with this report right now, looking out 10 years or more?
So science is a major driver of the American economy and obviously brings lots of cool things to us as consumers and American citizens. And so what we're looking at when we look at science and technology that's 10 years out is we're trying to give Congress a little bit of a heads up. You know, what is interesting out there, what is maturing in the science and technology domain that might be important to Americans in the next 10 years. And that's the entire purpose of this report and many of our other reports that look maybe not out 10 years, but look a few years out.
And when you look at science and technology trends, what are you actually evaluating? How do you separate what's credible in the near term from like science fiction in the long term?
That's a great question. And that's the tricky part of it. And when we do these reports, we're not being exhaustive. We issue one periodically, usually once a year, that looks at 3 to 4 different technologies. What we're looking for specifically is we're saying, okay, this technology is maturing to the point that it could potentially come to market in the form of some new device or some new capability that will be important to American citizens. In addition to that, we think there's some economic component to it. For example, one of the ones we looked at last year was manufacturing in space. And that's the reason that we thought that was interesting is there's been some demonstrations. There's definitely a need for this type of material that benefits from low, very almost near zero gravity. But additionally, the cost of just launching things into low Earth orbit is coming down to the point it could become economically viable.
Well, one of the things I love about the 3 trends in this year's report is that none of them has to do with AI. So, yay, we're not going to have an AI conversation. But tell us about the 3 trends that you call out.
So this year we looked at 3 really interesting technologies that are out there. The first is neural implants. And we're looking not just, neural implants exist today, and they're mostly in the research phase, but they're focused on dealing with a particular illness or disease and correcting that or trying to make life easier for someone who's disabled. We're looking at them from the perspective of, well, what if I just choose to get a neural implant? The second one we're looking at is general purpose robotics. And I'm sorry to say this does have a little bit of AI in it. But the idea here, and this has been something that's been science fiction for a while, but it's actually getting close. Think about a robot that is designed in such a way that it's not for a single purpose. It's not like your vacuum cleaner robot. It's not like a robotic arm that's manufacturing something there. It's a device that it could be humanoid. It could be something completely different that is there to just do what is helpful for you in your life or your work. And so we look both at the technology and then the software, and that's where the AI comes in. And the last one is really interesting. It kind of fits into the series we've been talking about that I mentioned in the early part of orbital debris cleanup. So there's a lot of material that we are putting into specifically low Earth orbit. This is where like Starlink satellites are, a lot of the other cluster satellites. What we're looking at is, okay, once these have reached the end of life, which isn't very long, most Starlink satellites and satellites of these constellations only last about 5 years. What are we doing with them? Are we cleaning them up? And are we making space for the next generation of technology to be launched?
I'm speaking with Dr. Sterling Thomas. He's GAO's chief scientist. As you relate those 3 trends in the report, you use a framework called STEER to evaluate them and to set up how agencies should be thinking about them. Can you walk us through the framework and then how you hope it shapes how both Congress and agencies are approaching these technologies?
Yeah, when we look at STEER, when we look at a technology, we use the framework of STEER. We're after how do we think about this, right? And so the ST are obvious. This is science and technology. But the next parts we're looking at, what is the economics of it? What is the environmental impact? We also, as part of the S, we look at the societal impact. I mean, think about AI is a great example. It's already had tremendous societal impacts. And the last R we're looking at is what is the regulatory framework for this? Meaning, is there and this is why it's important to Congress, is there something that needs to be considered to accelerate this technology? Is there something that needs to be considered in order to make sure it's used in the appropriate way? Think about, some of the cyber technologies that are out there that can be used both to protect us and our privacy, but also can be used to exploit cyber weakness. And so that's why we use the STEER framework, is to have a good handle of what we think is a complete picture of how this technology could be implemented and be made useful to the American public.
Of the three technologies that you look at here, and again, it's neural implants, general purpose robots, and technology to remove space junk, which of them do you think presents the most immediate challenge for federal agencies that make it harder to manage maybe than we might think?
Well, I think the one that is particularly, pressing right now is the orbital debris. And the reason for that is that when we're particularly looking at low Earth orbit, and space is big, absolutely, there's a lot of space up there. But in the low Earth orbit realm, there's actually not an infinite amount of space. Not only is it a particular range of distance from the Earth, it actually you can only put satellites in certain areas because of space weather and other interference. And so there is actually a limit of how much is up there. Plus, when you think about something in low Earth orbit, it is not a piece of something sitting somewhere. It is moving very, very, very fast. And so you have to keep track of where it's going all the time. And so making sure that space is available is really important, because we've obviously seen with some of the new technologies that are going up there, there's a lot of value for low Earth orbit. And there's a lot of really useful things. I mean, that's very close to where the International Space Station is as well. So how do we want to continue to use this domain that is particularly valuable for communications and science and research and economics, but also keep it clear so when you launch something into space, it doesn't get hit by something? And so there's quite a bit of interest in that area, and we think that's an area that needs the attention of Congress.
Almost all of these technologies would cross federal agency boundaries. So in the regulatory space, what are the biggest challenges you see when technology is still a little bit over the horizon and agencies need to get themselves together across boundaries to start to think about regulatory frameworks?
Well, and that's what we bring up in reports like these. We talk about what is the existing regulatory framework for each one of them. And we talk about what agencies are currently responsible for it, but also what could be done to help make it easier for industry to operate in these domains and bring that economic value that we know science and technology already brings to this country. The last thing that is actually really interesting, particularly in the space orbital debris, is it's not American property. Like, there's no American space, right? It's all space for every country. And so there's now, with that one, an international collaboration component, as we need to think about what treaties did we already agreed to? Do we need to modify them? Do we need to create new ones to help manage the material that's up in space so that everybody can benefit from it?
Congress is having trouble regulating technologies that we already have. Just take Bitcoin or cryptocurrency as one piece of that. Do they have the capacity to organize around these scientific concepts and develop regulatory frameworks?
Yeah, I mean, Congress has, they have us. We have a bunch of scientists and policy folks who work together to help them understand what the issues are and the technologies and the complexities of them. They often also have scientists within their office that are provided by different organizations and fellowships. So they have the capacity to do it. The question is, what is the benefit to their particular constituents? And I think that's where sometimes we get a little tangled up because, each little area is interested in what is best for them. And I think we're going to get there. In Congress, like I said, they have the capacity to do it. And I think you're going to start to see really interesting things coming out of them.
This report doesn't have recommendations, but it does have policy considerations. Walk us through those and where you think they'll wind up.
So some of the policy considerations we like to bring up for each one of these, and they're different from recommendations because, again, these are 10 years out. So where GAO often is looking at a program and saying, oh, this is something that needs to be corrected in order to save the taxpayers money or to improve the outcome of this particular program. We're often both. These aren't programs we're looking at. We're looking at the science and technology and a potential future economy. So the policy considerations we bring out are things like, we should look at the treaties for the space and make sure that there is an agreement that each country who's going to have a space program and is putting things into these limited orbits has a plan and a financial commitment to bring the technology down or to move it to a place that's not going to be in the way. For the generalized robotics, we need to think about, okay, if we're going to have these things in our home, around our children, they need to have some safety thoughts, right? We need to have some sort of framework that we can agree these technologies are safe and are going to do the things that we ask them to do. And then for the neural implants, that is really a fascinating area as well, because you think about, okay, if I can elect to get a neural implant that allows me to control my computer, does that make me a more valuable employee? All right. So is there going to be a time in the future where you get an advantage for a particular job because you have elected to get an implant? Well, what does that mean for our labor force? What does that mean to make sure that people have equal opportunities to get their jobs? So it does change the way we think about employment and the capacities and capabilities that each of us has as a expert or whatever we do. I mean, me as a scientist, I'm like, well, how does that impact my scientist? My job as a scientist, if I can control devices with my mind, that's pretty wild to think about.
I've been speaking with Dr. Sterling Thomas, GAO's chief scientist. Thanks so much for joining me today and helping us lift our eyes a little bit up to the horizon and see what's coming.
Happy to be here. Thank you so much.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, some of the biggest cyber risks to the military don't start inside government networks. But first, the administration is leaning on the Defense Production Act to shape supply chains through federal support, not mandates. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The latest use of the Defense Production Act expands federal tools to support domestic energy capacity across the supply chain. It does not compel action, but it opens a path for financing and program support. Whether that translates into projects will turn on agency follow-through. Scott Johnson of counsel at Foley and Lardner is here to share with us how that would work. Mr. Johnson, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome, Terry. Thanks for inviting me.
Back in April, the president issued several new determinations under Section 303 of the Defense Production Act. Walk us through, if you would, what the Defense Production Act actually is and what these new determinations are all about.
Sure, happy to. So yes, in late April, President Trump signed these 5 presidential determinations under the DPA, which is a Korean War-era law designed to expand domestic production of materials and technologies that are deemed essential for national defense. So all of these 5 determinations are directed to the Secretary of Energy, and they rest on findings that America's energy infrastructure is a matter of national defense. So in short, what that means now is that the federal government is authorized to fund and provide other sorts of support to everything from power grid upgrades to coal-fired power plants to oil exploration to even things like LNG export terminals. So whether you work in energy or build infrastructure or simply pay an electric bill as a consumer, these determinations are important because they could fundamentally reshape how we power the country.
Is there some external shock, like the operations in Iran, that precipitated this rash of determinations, or is it part of a longer assessment of the U.S. energy infrastructure?
Well, I think it would be easy to connect them to the current military operation overseas. However, as we know from President Trump's first term and even getting into his second term, there is a lot of concern on the part of the administration about America's energy infrastructure, including things like executive orders that the president has issued declaring a national energy emergency. So my personal view is that this ties into the larger picture and isn't specifically related to the Iran conflict.
Do these determinations require companies to do anything, or do they just make certain actions permissible?
So that's a great question. They don't affect or require companies to do anything directly, but this is more a situation where their issuance may open doors to new or expanded projects or programs going forward. They're not self-executing, so we'll be relying on the Department of Energy to issue funding opportunities, requests for proposals, requests for funding, things like that going forward.
So practically speaking, are they like new projects that are opening, but DOE still requires funding to execute them?
They could be new projects. They could be existing projects that the government wants to provide more support to. But the key aspect of all of them is that it is really in their breadth. The scope of the determinations was really remarkably broad in that they don't target a single technology or product, but rather they cover grid infrastructure like transformers and transmission lines, large-scale energy project development in general, petroleum production and refining, coal supply chains, baseload power projects, and natural gas and LNG capacity. So when you look at them as a whole, they really touch virtually every segment of their traditional energy value chain, including the grid hardware that would be needed to deliver that power. So it's really a very, very broad scope in terms of projects and opportunities.
With that really broad landscape, do you see parts of it that are going to be like the first to be operationalized? Are there other sectors that are going to be harder to bring to bear?
I don't necessarily think so. I mean, a lot of that will come from what we see coming out of DOE in future months and years while this authorization is in place. So really, there could be any number of funding opportunities that come out for different projects across energy sectors. And it will really just be up to companies that are operating in those sectors to keep an eye out for what's coming along, to engage early with DOE to see if they could take advantage of some of those opportunities, and then turn this sort of framework into executable programs.
Scott Johnson is of counsel with Foley and Lardner. So, Mr. Johnson, as you think about all of these opportunities here and the Department of Energy, who's going to have to operationalize them, what are the biggest execution hurdles for DOE? Is it funding? Is it regulation? Is it assessment of the marketplace?
Well, I think two things to think about there. One is that the toolbox that DOE has as a result of these determinations is really quite broad and powerful. Section 303 of the DPA gives DOE the authority to make direct purchases, purchase commitments, to issue grants, loans, loan guarantees, and even make equity investments to expand production in the areas that the determinations focus on. So I think part of the challenge will be to figure out what method or methods work best for what sectors of the industry, and how DOE can bring, the authority issued in the determinations to bear on industry. That means for companies potential access to, billions of federal dollars for projects that align with these covered categories, from pipeline buildouts to transformer manufacturing. But the thing that I think really will determine how effective these are is the money question. The determinations are only going to have as much impact as the funding behind them. So a lot is going to rest on how much money Congress continues to appropriate for the DPA fund, including the additional $1 billion appropriated through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Whether that ends up being enough to support these actions fully will sort of depend on whether Congress will need to appropriate more money, the extent and nature of any legal or political challenges to these determinations, and how all of that fits together going forward.
So you're sort of pointing out there that these directions don't operate in a vacuum, that there is a market out there, and that DOE also has some actions it has to take. Where do you see potential friction here? Do these supersede existing relationships or have higher priority? How do they play out?
They don't. So existing contracts and regulations don't just disappear as a result of these. The additional DPA support doesn't automatically override other legal or regulatory requirements or existing contracts. So it'll be important for companies that might be affected by these funding opportunities or in a position to take advantage of them to review their existing commercial agreements, including things like output commitments or supply allocations, change in law clauses, for example, because the DOE purchase commitments or financial instruments that could arise from these determinations definitely could intersect with those contracts in some unexpected ways. So this is more of just an additional layer on top of the existing federal contracting structure for energy products and services, but doesn't displace existing law, regulations, or contracts.
If DOE does start to issue projects through the Section 303, do they get expedited environmental review or permitting requirements? Is there anything else that helps grease the skids towards completion of the projects?
Also, a very good question. To my knowledge, there isn't any particular impact of these determinations on things like permitting. There is a lot of discussion in the energy industry these days about permitting reform, actions that Congress might be able to take to facilitate the faster development of energy projects. So the way that I view these is certainly as fuel on the fire for moving those things forward more quickly, but there would still need to be separate action if there is going to be any change to the larger permitting regime or how these projects are ultimately developed, including the extent to which they're regulated at the state level, which is an entirely separate question.
So what is the real point of issuing these determinations then? Is it just a declaration, a roadmap to where the administration is prioritizing development? Because it sounds like ultimately it all depends on whether money actually flows in one direction or another.
That's exactly right. That's the multi-billion-dollar question here. The bottom line, in my view, is that the determinations are a significant signal of federal intent in this area. But like I said, they're not self-executing, so the real story is going to be written over the next, months and years by DOE as it translates these presidential directives into actual programs and dollars that companies can take advantage of. Those that are paying attention now, mapping their projects to the categories covered by the determinations, engaging with DOE and going through sort of like a stress test of their existing contracts, are probably going to be the companies best positioned to benefit from these determinations and the funding and other opportunities that could flow from them. They definitely open doors, but sort of going through those doors and benefiting is going to take preparation and vigilance on behalf of the companies that are in a position to do that.
So for those companies who are in this space, the best guidance is to watch for the latest funding opportunities.
Absolutely. So a lot of this should be coming out in the Federal Register. So keep an eye on the DOE section of the FR to see what funding opportunities might arise. To the extent that companies can be prepared to jump on those when they become available, all the better. And we'll see what happens.
I've been speaking with Scott Johnson. He is of counsel with Foley and Lardner. Mr. Johnson, thanks so much for breaking this all down for us.
Thank you, Terry. Really appreciate it.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, some of the biggest cyber risks to the military don't start inside government networks. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. By opening its Defense Industrial Base cybersecurity program to new partners, the Pentagon is trying to reduce vulnerabilities across the supply chain. As those risks extend beyond government systems into the private sector, partnerships become central. How that model works and what success looks like is at the center of my conversation with Terry Kalka, Director of the Defense Industrial Base Collaborative Information Sharing Environment at the Defense Department Cybercrime Center. Mr. Kalka, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to speak to you.
The Pentagon has invested heavily in cyber defenses, but this new effort with DC-3 puts partnership with industry at the center of its engagement. Why is right now the right time to expand the partnership agreements?
The partnership agreements we have with industry are key to an exchange of cyber threat information that is not available from commercial sources. And at a time when we are looking to strengthen the defense of our arsenal of freedom, we are eager to extend this partnership out across the defense industrial base to the maximum extent possible.
What sort of threats are you seeing, if you can share them in an unclassified way, that motivate this higher concern?
If you look at what is publicly available and what is impacting industry and critical infrastructure, you will find that the defense industrial base is not exempt from any of those types of things. So whether we're talking about the nation-state threats of our primary competitors, or whether we're looking at ransomware driven by cybercrime actors, the defense industrial base faces the same level of threat. And because of where they are in the ecosystem, in some cases, they face a very unique set of threats where an adversary is looking for information that perhaps properly belongs to the Department of War and may not find it within a Department of War environment, but can sort of start to poke and prod through an industrial environment to look for it. Our supply chain is our strength, and we need to do everything in our power to help them defend themselves.
This new announcement opens up the Defense Industrial Base cybersecurity program to new partners. What is actually changing with this new announcement for both companies and for the government as you think about the sharing of information?
So there are two things that changed in the last couple of years that I would like to highlight because there was a lot of change with the new administration, a lot of executive orders, and we needed to take some time to make sure we were properly aligned and following the direction that we've been given. So the program, which actually began in 2008, was initially for cleared defense contractors only. And we built up some momentum. We began with some 16 companies in 2008 and then hit well over the 1,000 mark. And in 2024, there was a change to the federal rule governing the program where we are able to open the program to non-cleared defense contractors. So having a clearance or a facility clearance is no longer a requirement. And what we are looking at are companies who store or process sensitive unclassified information, in many cases controlled unclassified information, but there are other types of sensitive information they may have, and we're looking to bring them into the fold. So that was announced in 2024. In 2025, we put a strategic pause on new membership while we sorted through the direction the administration was taking in cybersecurity. So what has effectively happened is we have picked up where we left off. What is new for companies joining now is, first of all, the advantage of joining this trusted partnership. Some of these organizations have been with us for 5, 10, 15 years. Some of the actual people have been with us since the beginning of the program, and that's very gratifying to see them returning year after year. I would also say that with a renewed focus on not just the defense of sensitive information, but the continuity of operational activity. We are very interested in helping secure OT systems that are at risk to ensure that critical systems can operate in support of the department.
How does this collaboration space that DC3 is managing compare or augment some of the collaboration groups that are managed by CISA?
Excellent question. So in the world of policy, we have 16 critical infrastructure sectors. The Department of War is the sector risk management agency for the DIB. CISA is the sector risk management agency for about half of those others, and then CISA has a central coordinating role. So what this looks like on a day-to-day basis is that information we get that we think needs to be promulgated to the other critical infrastructure sectors, we pass that to CISA. When CISA gets information that is particularly relevant to the DIB, they send that right back to us. So there's an ongoing exchange of information. CISA, by nature of their posture within the ecosystem, they tend to be more focused, first of all, on the federal civilian executive branches, and then the 8 or so sectors of critical infrastructure where they have designated authorities and responsibilities. So I would describe it as a partnership and a partnership of partnerships. Where they have partnerships, we're happy to come in and help. Where we have partnerships, we're happy to help make connections.
Terry Kalka is director of the DoD Defense Industrial Base Collaborative Information Sharing Environment inside the Department of Defense Cybercrime Center. Let's go back to the fact that you've opened up this partnership opportunity now to non-cleared contractors. If a contractor is considering joining, what do they need to know? What are partners required to provide here? What sort of protections do they get if they're participating?
That's a great question. So the key requirement to join is, do you have a contract with the Department of War, and do you process controlled unclassified information or other sensitive information? There is what's called a medium assurance certificate. It is a security certificate that you're actually already required to get. A lot of companies don't have them, but it is in your contract under your DFARS 252.204-7012 clause. That certificate is what allows us to communicate with you via encrypted email, right? So a lot of my colleagues in the department don't realize most defense contractors don't have CACs. They don't have the same types of access and authentication capabilities. So these certificates are what allow us to exchange confidential information. The other thing is there's a framework agreement, about 8 pages, that essentially defines the terms of the partnership. We will provide the company with government-furnished information. They will not share that information beyond the confines of this partnership. Any information they share with us voluntarily, we will use to augment cyber defenses in the DIB and the department, but we will not attach that information back to the name of the company. So if Terry Kelka Inc. reports cyber activity, we think, hey, we would like the rest of the DIB to know about this. We will share the technical information and the indicators of compromise. We will conduct analysis on that information to augment and amplify it. We'll pass that information throughout the Department of War so that we can use it for our defenses. But at no point does it say this info originated with Terry Kelka Inc., unless you want us to do that. And what that does is it builds an environment of trust where we have companies who will talk to us about things that they're seeing that they're not necessarily comfortable sharing with other agencies or other entities.
This seems like a pretty general invitation now for folks to partner with DC3 in this information sharing arrangement. Are there particular contractors you're hoping volunteer, or is there a limit to the number of people who can come?
There isn't a limit. In fact, as long as I have been involved with this program, which is now 8.5 years, I have been in some way associated with it. I've been the director for about 2.5 years. We've always had the risk/opportunity. What if you wake up one day and 10,000 companies sign up all at once? That's a problem I would love to have. I invite people to bring me that problem. We have standard repeatable processes that we follow. We have measured workflows. We have ways of managing the workload so that we can try to ease the burden when we hit a bottleneck at some point. But we've not hit a limit to the number of companies. We are eager for small and medium businesses to sign aboard because we know they don't have necessarily the resources to defend themselves. What you get when you partner with us are a couple of key things. One is cybersecurity defensive information that is 95% unique. You cannot acquire it from another channel. You also get access to, if you wish, a number of cyber services that we offer. I'd like to highlight a couple of those briefly. Our Defense Industrial Base Vulnerability Disclosure Program. We bring in friendly researchers to look at your public infrastructure and look for vulnerabilities. And if they find them, they report them. And then we will work with you to mitigate them and get them patched, hopefully before there's an actual intrusion. We have a capability we call Dice Cubed. This is analysis of firewall logs. It allows us to find activity. Given just a few indicators, we're able to locate and warn potential and actual victims of malicious activity. And thirdly, you get a collaborative environment. You're able to join us for our semi-annual technical exchange. It's a conference we run in the National Capital Region. We also go out around the country to do regional partner exchanges. And the ability to have face-to-face communication and conversations around cyber threat provides a level of information and again, trust that's invaluable and not something you simply get through email exchanges.
So if we've piqued someone's interest out there and they missed the announcement and want to know more, where should they go?
The fastest place is dc3.mil. The DICE and DIB cybersecurity program is part of a larger effort going on at the DoD Cybercrime Center, also known as DC3. And you can email us for more information at dc3.dcise@us.af.mil.
All right. We'll share that on our website when we post this interview. Mr.
Wonderful,
Terry
thank
Kelka is Director of the DoD Defense Industrial Base Collaborative Information Sharing Environment at the Department of Defense Cybercrime Center. Thanks so much for joining me today.
It's been great to talk to you, Terry. Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has launched a sweeping review of the military legal system, directing the Pentagon's general counsel to convene a special review panel that will conduct what he described as an ongoing, long-term, department-wide review of all aspects of the military legal system. The review faces numerous challenges, and the panel structure will determine whether it leads to meaningful reform. For more details, Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis spoke with Ira Rushing, an associate at the Tully-Rinke law firm.
What the panel is going to do is it's going to operate on this sustained basis rather than just a single end of review report. And so the idea is that it'll deliver some interim reports, recommendations on specific issues kind of as they're completed. And the objectives that are stated are to cut the bureaucracy and strengthen training and organization and refine culture and all these things that kind of objectively are good deals. I think Secretary Hegseth's framing in the memo is really that the review it's not about diminishing the essential role of the legal experts, but to provide support for effective legal advice that upholds the rule of law and all of that. And it's happened before. There's been previous assessments, the statutory reviews, the General Accountability Office, the GAO reports, things like that, but that we just need to do it more comprehensively and more sustained over a longer period of time now. So I think as far as what the audience cares about is that the announcement isn't in isolation. It's really the third major move on the military legal system in the last year and a half. He fired the different branches' top lawyers, saying that they were roadblocks to order or whatever he said, and then more recently ordered this no excuses review, as he called it, directing the service secretaries and everybody to cut duplication and bureaucracy and all that kind of stuff. So it sounds like you consistently over the course of time, the idea has just been to reduce waste and not make things so convoluted and insane. And whether or not that is done with a potential goal in mind of reducing administrative oversight, I don't know. And to be fair, I am a major and a JAG in the Mississippi Army National Guard. So, what I say now is really just as a private military law practitioner and not necessarily the views of Department of Defense. But I think periodic review of the military legal system is a good thing, right? It's healthy, and prior reviews like the Military Justice Review Group and Independent Review Commission on Sexual Assault, all those things, they produce some real improvements. And so the question's not whether to review, but how the review is structured, who sits on it, what its independence looks like, and kind of how it interacts with statutory oversight mechanisms that Congress already created. And so in terms of maybe what actually needs reform, there's a lot of it. I live it. The Board for Corrections and Military Records, the Discharge Review Board side, we're waiting 2 years for adjudication of cases. There's inconsistent application of some liberal consideration policies. There's evidentiary practices that are completely different between the services. There's chronic backlog. And then from trial defense and military justice, defense counsel resourcing is a huge pain, and expert witness funding is a huge pain, and kind of IDC continuity. And then from the administrative separation side, there's all these inconsistencies and disparities across the different branches that if the goal is to close that gap, then great, I'm all for it. There's a lot of areas of the military legal system that need reform. My concern would be that the announcement kind of describes this panel as ongoing and convened by DoD General Counsel, which is a presidentially appointed political position. So if you compare that to the Military Justice Review Panel, that's statutory, that Congress designed to provide the same periodic independent assessment, but with civilian, academic, and practitioner members, the independent structure is if it's all inside DOD and DOD general counsel is a political appointee, the perception of fairness in military justice itself is going to be kind of a strategic asset. And plus, sustained reform, it takes statutory change, and this panel itself can't amend the UCMJ. So, and then, I guess finally, their relationship with Congress and with existing oversight bodies is going to be kind of unclear. So I don't know. I mean, there needs to be reform. If it's reform in military justice, everybody's inherently going to question it. And if it's reform to everything else, I don't even know that they will have the jurisdictional authority to do a lot of it.
Going back to what you said in terms of this memo is happening in the context, we had another memo a couple of months ago about the overhaul of all the military, civilian, and uniformed legal offices. How do these two efforts differ?
I think you kind of have to read between the lines, because I know that some of the critics of the last memo from March kind of say that it was about evading legal oversight of the administration's actions in some contexts, and the appropriate role of the uniformed legal advice in operational decisions and things like that, with the boat strikes, the war in Iran. That's a serious question with a really long history, but it's really kind of internal advisory processes that the civilian lawyers and stuff aren't really too involved with to be. So military legal advice has been bipartisan for a long time and needs to stay that way. So whatever the motivation is behind the last memo and this one, the current panel's recommendation, I think, will be judged more by whether they strengthen or weaken independence. With regards to like JAGs being assigned as immigration judges and federal prosecutors, which I know you and I have talked about before, the practical issue is that a JAG on detail to DOJ is a JAG not available for courts martial or administrative separation boards or claims or fiscal law work. And so part of the reform needs to address the fact that these services have been under-resourced for legal services, or the service branches have been under-resourced for legal services for a long time. And any sort of forced structure decisions that come from this really need to have that in mind. They need to strengthen against rising demand from sexual assault prosecutions or expanded administrative separation activity and increased contracting work. And so whether you support the underlying policies in terms of work from a workforce standpoint, the workforce math is the workforce math. And so hopefully these notices with regards to removing bureaucracy aren't pretext for removing people.
Going back to what you said about it's going to be important how the review is structured, the independent structure of it, but given how they're structuring it, what should we expect?
I think the last couple of years have allowed us to expect that we can't expect anything in particular that's coming out right now. It's going to be interesting. So in terms of the independence, because again, that's kind of the big thing, is I would have some reservations about it having the panel structured and convened by DoD General Counsel, who is in itself a bureaucratic position. So a bureaucrat making suggestions on how to reduce bureaucracy, I think, throughout the history of time has never often been a very good idea. But again, the difference between this being an executive branch panel versus a legislative branch panel is its ability to actually effectuate any change to begin with. It can put out things that Secretary Hegseth has authority to change as the Secretary of Defense, but they can't change statutes. They can't change the UCMJ. They can't, how much input they have on the National Defense Authorization Act every year is going to be limited. So it's almost kind of like it's a good idea because, again, review is good. We like review. We want it. We want there to be review. I don't know what it's going to do, right? Like in terms for the service member who's facing a court martial or administrative action today, nothing's going to change. The UCMJ is still going to be the UCMJ. The manual for courts martial is still going to be unchanged. The Army Regulation 27-10 or JAG against 5800 or Air Force Instruction 51-201. Like all of those are still in force, and the services trial defense organizations are still operating, and the boards are still adjudicating. So what matters for the individual service member right now is whether they're going to have qualified representation. So the reform debate's important, but because it's operating on multi-year horizon, it's kind of like, somebody's Article 32 hearing next month is happening under current rules. So, but going forward, if there are manpower changes that affect what is already a really strained ability to get appointed military counsel, that might be kind of difficult. But I guess what I would want to see to determine whether the review is credible, I'd want to see the independent membership include former TJAGs, retired military judges, academic experts, defense practitioners. I'd want to see a public charter and a public interim reports. I'd want to see it coordinate with the existing military justice review panel through Congress rather than just displacing it. And so if the panel produces those things, then okay, legitimate reform agenda has a real shot. But if it doesn't, it's just going to be seen as an internal political document, kind of regardless of the quality of its recommendations. Reviewing the military legal system is not a problem. Reviewing it inside the building without independent structure that prior efforts had is a structural concern even before these recommendations land.
That's Tully Rinke's Ira Rushing, speaking with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find her full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, getting the rules right early can shape both the safety and growth of emerging technologies. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.